Good afternoon, everyone from Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. Welcome to this event from the Asia Scotland Institute. My name is Martin Perwick. I'm the coordinator for the event. Our focus today is a presentation and discussion of relations with Iran. And what we've asked, will this be a new era from 2021? If I could just introduce Iran from the perspective of Scotland, because there is a little bit of history of dialogue here. Scotland has been the venue for prior discussions of relations with Iran. The EU policy of engaging with Iran actually started from a Council of Europe meeting in Edinburgh, Scotland, in December 1992. And it was at that time that the Council of Europe stated that, and I quote, "Given Iran's importance in the region, the European Council reaffirms its belief that a dialogue should be maintained with the Iranian government. This should be a critical dialogue which reflects concern about Iranian behavior and calls for improvement in a number of areas," and went on to discuss them. And that meeting of the European Council is often referred to as the starting point for perhaps the more pragmatic outlook towards Iran from Europe. And I'm very pleased that we're back to Edinburgh today, where I am, to restart that discussion, hopefully. So it's our pleasure to welcome our panel guests to Edinburgh. They're not here in person, obviously, for our discussion today. I think all of our guests bring quite unique insight into Iran from their absolutely exceptional and very long experience. And if I could just say a little bit about each of them. Dr. Ayatollah Sayyid Salman Safavi is a distinguished philosopher, a scholar of Islamic sciences from the Seminary of Qom, a BA, MA in philosophy from Tehran, and a PhD and postdoctorate from SOAS in London. Dr. Safavi was a research fellow at the University of London from 2000 until 2011, and a research deputy at the Islamic Centre of England and director of the Institute of Islamic Studies in London from 1997 to 2003. He's been director of the London Academy of Iranian Studies since 2003 and editor-in-chief of the Transcendent Philosophy Journal. He's also published, I think, more than 50 books on international relations, Islamic studies, comparative philosophy, and Sufism. Quite an extraordinary, long and distinguished career. So welcome today, Dr. Safavi. Also, we have Dr. Mehrdad Konsari, who began his diplomatic career at the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1968. And he served for many years in Tehran, Washington, the United Nations in New York, also the Iranian mission to the UN. He was a member of the Secretariat of the Iranian Minister of Foreign Affairs, and in 1977 to the Iranian Embassy in London. And he later went on to become a visiting research fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. From 1979 to 1984, Dr. Konsari was a consultant in international affairs for an organization that was later transformed and became the Center for Arab and Iranian Studies. Since 1991, he's been an advisor with numerous organizations. He is a senior consultant, a founding member of the Iranian Center for Policy Studies. And finally, please excuse me, Dr. Vakil, for coming to you last, Dr. Sanam Vakil, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House, as well as the Project Director of Future Dynamics of the Gulf, Middle East and North Africa Program. She follows wider Middle East issues as a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, associated with the Working Group on Islamism and the International Order. She is also the James Anderson Professorial Lecturer in Middle East Studies Department at Johns Hopkins in Italy, I understand, in their campus in Italy, I think that means, excuse me if I got that wrong, and the author of Action and Reaction, Women and Politics in Iran. She publishes analysis and comments for a variety of media and academic outlets, I beg your pardon, which you can see through the Chatham House website, and most prolific she is indeed. So if I could remind our attendees today, we're on the Zoom webinar platform. Your videos and microphones cannot be displayed and only the panelists can be seen and heard. We do, however, want to have some interaction with the audience. We want to have some discussion and raise your questions. So I'd be very grateful if you could raise questions in the Zoom chat function. either privately to me or publicly to the attendees, if you wish. And we'll try to get through your questions when we come to them after the panel discussion. So first of all, could I please ask Dr. Konsari, would you like to say a few opening words and then perhaps lead on to introduce Dr. Safavi?
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. I will start by presenting an overview of the situation in Iran at this time, and then Dr. Safavi and Dr. Vakil can get into the intricate details of discussing what's going on. This year, the start of the Iranian New Year on 21st March, or Nowruz, as is commonly referred to by Iranians, also marks the start of a new century based on the Persian solar calendar. The start of this new era comes at a time when Iran is grappling with many important challenges, ranging from a severely damaged economy as a result of the brutal sanctions imposed by Trump's policy of maximum pressure, to the terrible impact of the COVID pandemic, which is currently undergoing its fourth wave with unprecedented consequences. Only a few days ago on Tuesday, did the director of Tehran's main cemetery acknowledge that the number of burials had broken a 50-year record, exceeding even those at the height of the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. Although the ruling establishment in Iran, that includes the elected government, as well as all the powerful non-elected power centers, remain both unchallenged and firmly in control in a country that is both secure and stable, nonetheless, there are mounting pressures, albeit latent, because of the dire economic situation of the average Iranian confronted with issues such as high inflation, unemployment, along with other pressures that stem from the needs of a young and well-educated population needing greater social freedoms, free from the strictures of rigid theocracy. In the sphere of foreign policy, all hopes are now currently focused on the outcome of the nuclear talks that are being conducted at this time in Vienna. The hope is that with the return of the US to the JCPOA, some, if not all, of Trump's harsh economic sanctions may be removed, and that foreign trade and investment with Iran may once again be revived. Here it is important to point out that Iran has justly the right to feel abused by the US decision to unashamedly break its commitments under the JCPOA, and for the Europeans not to come to Iran's help in any meaningful way, despite Iran having fulfilled all of its obligations under that agreement at that time. But serious challenges still lay ahead, as Iran has repeatedly stated that it will not negotiate the JCPOA, while the Biden administration has clearly stated the need for a JCPOA plus agreement that would include a thorough revision of Iran's missile program, as well as its overall regional policy and its commitments to various proxy forces in Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. While the road ahead seems somewhat grueling, there is nonetheless a desire on the part of both the US and Iran to find a way forward. Within Iran, given the upcoming presidential election in which hardline conservatives are tipped to win, the current JCPOA talks have sadly become something of a political football, with hardliners keen on denying the Rouhani government and any potential moderate presidential candidate the luxury of claiming any high-profile diplomatic success that may come out of these talks. An unprecedented television program aired on Iran's state TV channel controlled by the hardliners a few nights ago that aimed to discredit the Iranian negotiating team in Vienna clearly illustrates this point. Finally, at a time of increasing US-China rivalry, the consequences of a serious Iranian tilt towards China and away from Europe, and by implication, the US and the West, a notion that is likely to be pursued by a new hardline government if the current JCPOA talks do not pan out in a desired manner, could potentially alter the existing geopolitical calculations, not just for Iran, but for the entire region and the West. While the majority of the GCC countries, as well as Israel, have been quite vocal in their reservations about the agreement that was reached in 2015, and are equally skeptical of what is now happening in Vienna, any major tilt by Iran towards China, already Iran's first trading partner for the last 10 years, at a time when the US is signaling retrenchment from the region, could have an unprecedented impact on all calculations pertaining to security in that part of the world. It is essential, bearing in mind that while the importance of oil may have declined for the US, the exact opposite is the case for China, especially in the context of the next 10 years and beyond. The last thing that the West and regional states in the Persian Gulf would want to grapple with is the permanent presence of other navies, such as those of China or Russia, gaining a foothold in any Iranian seaport. Anyway, having said this, I now pass the floor to Ayatollah Safavi. Ayatollah Safavi, who's not just a scholar in his own right in matters pertaining to Sufism and religion and things like that, but is a scholar, quite a tested scholar in the field of diplomacy and politics as well, and has performed astutely well over the years in promoting better UK-Iran relations. And so with having said that, I now ask Dr. Safavi to pick up the...
Thank you for your constructive talk, Dr. Khonsari. I'm very happy to have a short presentation, and thanks for invitation. First, I will discuss the current state of the relation between Iran and the West from the perspective of Iran. Second, I will briefly offer some suggestions for improving relations between Iran and the West. I will expand on this suggestion further in the question and answer section. Currently, the relations between Iran and the majority of countries of the world is positive and constructive, other than relations between Iran and the United States and its regional ally, with both of whom relations are extremely tense. As a result of US actions during the Trump era, such as leaving the JCPOA, starting an economic war against the Iranian nation through sanctions, and the terror of the General Qasem Soleimani by the direct order of the American president, Iran and the US have been in the worst era of their relations since 1979. Also, Europe did not exit the JCPOA. It was not able of fulfilling its commitments on Iran. America's strategic partner in the region has been conducting the assassinated Iranian scientist Dr. Fakhrizadeh and have damaged one of Iran's nuclear facilities. The West has sold advanced offensive weapons such as advanced fighter jets to Iran's neighbors, which has resulted in an increase in tension and insecurity in the region and is a direct threat to the national security of Iran. However, Iran hopes that in the era of President Biden, the US has understood that through economic war against the Iranian nation, it cannot make Iran surrender to its irrational demands. Thus, in the current era, Iran hopes that the tensions in Iran-US relations are lowered by the US changing its behavior. Iran is ready to expand its economic relation with Europe. Expanding economic relations between Iran and Britain can be helpful to the British economy in the post-Brexit era. Iran policy, in the light of the experience of JCPOA and American sanctions during the Trump era in the field of economy, defense, and international relations, are as follows. First, in the economic field, Iran has concentrated on the national development by relying on domestic capabilities. In the past few years, Iran has made good advance in the fields of the knowledge-based companies, nanotechnology, stem cell, refineries, and the mining industry. Secondly, Iran is expansion of economic relationship with China and Russia. And thirdly, if Europe is ready, Iran will welcome economic cooperation with Europe. Second, in the defense field, from the perspective of Iran, there is a global military apartheid. Military apartheid, which is led by the US. The United States is the greatest threat to the global security, particularly due to its large arsenals of nuclear and other offensive weapons. Having the largest military budget in the world and as the largest exporter of the weapon in the world, particularly to the West Asia. Therefore, because of continuing military threat by the US against Iran, the arming of Iran's neighbors with the advanced offensive weapons, and the experience of 8-year war imposed by Iraq on Iran, 1980 to 1989, in which Iraq's military was armed by the West with advanced weapons, including chemical weapons, Iran has adopted a missile defense policy in order to defend itself and its people and its territorial integrity. The suggestion that Iran should limit its missile defense is an unrealistic suggestion which does not consider Iran's national security considerations. It is a suggestion born out of military apartheid. Therefore, from the perspective of Iran, under current situation, it is completely unacceptable. Third, Iran's international relation policy is that of maintaining constructive relation with the majority of international community, expanding relation with the Asia, lowering tensions with the Saudi Arabia, and actively supporting international and regional peace and security. Iran considers the presence of American military base and military vessels in the Persian Gulf to be dangerous to the security of the Persian Gulf and the national interests of Iran. In the framework of lowering tensions between Iran and the US and Iran's neighbors, I have the following suggestion. First, considering the behavior of Trump administration, the US exiting the JCPOA and the terror of General Soleimani, Iran distrusts America. Therefore, the US government should give practical guarantee to Iran that by a change of government in the US after Biden, it will not cancel agreement and treaties between Iran and the US. Second, in order to establish peace and security in the Persian Gulf, Western military forces must leave the Persian Gulf. Third, defense cooperation agreements should be signed between all countries of the Persian Gulf in order to provide security for the all Persian Gulf countries. Fourth, Iran will cooperate for the respectable extraction of Saudi Arabia from Yemen and is ready to cooperate with Saudi Arabia to lower tensions based on the legitimate interests of both sides. 5, the confront of the nuclear race both globally and in the Middle East, and to start global nuclear disarmament, it is suggested that as a first step, the Middle East be entitled as nuclear weapon free zone. And government which violate this should be sanctioned by the international community. 6, considering the great economic potential of Iran in terms of natural resources, especially human resources, and a strong industrial structure, Iran welcomes economic cooperation with Europe, and I think this cooperation will be beneficial for both sides. 7, Iran is ready to support Afghanistan and the West so that after Western military forces leave Afghanistan, this country does not once again become a haven for foreign terrorists to stage terror operation against the West from. 8, Iran is ready to expand its cooperation with the Europe in various fields, such as fight against terrorism, stopping the production, distribution, and smuggling of narcotics, and the environmental crisis and other important areas of common interest and concern. Conclusion. It appears that considering the defeat of the American policy maximum pressure against Iran, perhaps the US has become aware and realized that by the changing its hostile behavior towards the Iranian nation, we can return to diplomacy and dialogue and start a new era of good relationship between Iran and the West based on common economic, political, political and security interests. I thank the organizer of this webinar, Defense and Security Forum and Asia Scotland Institute. Thank you very much.
Dr. Safavi, thank you very much. It's most fascinating to be able to hear directly the perspective of interest from Iran, I think, and obviously not through an analyst, but most directly what those interests are and how they're articulated from the Iranian regime. So thank you very much for articulating the Iranian perspective. Perhaps if we could step back and if I could introduce Dr. Sanam Vakil from Chatham House in your role as an academic and an analyst and an observer. Perhaps you could talk to us about the middle way and the overview from your perspective.
Thank you so much, Martin, and it's a great pleasure to be here today. Appreciate the invitation, and I'm happy to share my views, which hopefully will be the middle way. As an analyst, we guard against our personal viewpoints and opinions, and try to see all sides of the many issues driving tensions between Iran and the United States, but also tensions among Middle East states. And rather than focus specifically on US-Iranian relations, I thought I would sort of broaden out and take the prism of the current JCPOA discussions underway in Vienna and talk about regional dynamics in the Middle East, which Dr. Safavi alluded to and sort of laid out a government perspective in Iran, although there is not a monolithic perspective in Iran, and I think it's important to stress that there are contending views within the political system in Iran, laid out a position of in support of regional engagement on the one hand, but also one where the US has been a destabilizing actor in the region. I currently, of course, very welcome the current JCPOA negotiations in Vienna. This is what we see at Chatham House to be a very important stepping stone to stabilizing the region. Dr. Khonsari very clearly laid out the challenges of President Trump's maximum pressure campaign, which have put undue levels of stress on the Iranian political system, but also on ordinary Iranians that have been struggling to make ends meet and contending with economic challenges that are far beyond what was anticipated and expected, particularly with the COVID crisis adding to these strains. It's in this sort of context that Iran, in response to President Trump's maximum pressure campaign, which over the years of his administration saw the US government impose over 1,500 sanctions on the Iranian economy, that Iran responded using its regional relationships as leverage to pursue a maximum resistance strategy to transfer the costs of maximum pressure to regional states as a means to show Iran's potential regional leverage, regional strength, ability to transfer some of the damage to the region, and with the hope that that would then result in negotiations. Here we are in Vienna, and I think something that we can sort of safely conclude is that maximum pressure did not achieve its objectives, which were twofold. One, to negotiate a broader JCPOA, a more strengthened JCPOA, but two, a stated objective of the Trump administration was to reduce Iran's relationships in the region, where Iran has supported a variety of different groups in other countries and transferred lethal aid into those countries, resulting in further destabilizing capacity. And so we've, through this sort of background, it's very important, of course, to contextualize, as Dr. Safavid provided his opinion, that Iran's position in the region is seen in Tehran as defensive, but it is perceived in the region as offensive. And so this mismatch of security threats and perceptions is really important to understand. And trying to square these differences and address these security imbalances lie at the heart of regional challenges in the Middle East that have become quite embedded. We are seeing profound levels of mistrust among different Middle Eastern states, but also within states themselves and communities themselves. So it becomes harder to unlock these differences. But the JCPOA and the return to the JCPOA could be seen as a first step to addressing regional issues. And this is because Tehran has made it clear that before it intends to open the portfolio and potentially discuss anything further, the JCPOA must be stabilized, and commitments that were made in 2015 have to be restored. So what we're witnessing in Vienna is what I hope will be a first step to broader discussions where regional issues will be brought back onto the agenda. A huge mistake that was made is that in the period from 2015 to 2018, there was no effort to address regional challenges and address security imbalances in the region. And without an effort that must be multilateral and requires the participation of multiple regional actors at the table, the JCPOA will remain forever vulnerable. And we're seeing this now with the independent activity that the Israeli government is pursuing inside Iran and against Iran around the region. And at the same time, security perceptions of Gulf Arab states must also be considered. The Saudi government, of course, is heavily involved in the war in Yemen, but deeply looking to de-escalate. And at the same time is being beset with daily drone and missile strikes coming from the Houthis that receive lethal aid from Iran. So the connectivity of these issues really speaks to the need for a broader dialogue on regional security. At Chatham House, we have sort of recently released a body of work that looks at the pathways of de-escalation. We've identified that the return to the JCPOA is an essential foundational step to address regional security challenges. But beyond that, what is urgently needed is the pursuit of multilateral negotiating tracks where the international community, alongside regional actors, and Iran is very much included in this, and its participation and positive participation is urgently needed, should be looking to de-escalate the war in Yemen, the war in Syria, and trying to stabilize Middle East tensions. And this, I think, connects to a broader geopolitical challenge that is also worthwhile mentioning. It's very clear that despite investment in saving the JCPOA that we're seeing from the Biden administration and renewed engagement on important multilateral issues like climate change, for example, the United States is deeply preoccupied with geopolitical priorities pertaining to Russia and China, pertaining to its own domestic demands back home. And it no longer has the bandwidth or the interest in supporting the security of its partners and allies in the region. And what we have witnessed over the past few years in the climate of uncertainty about U.S. commitments is greater competition in the region, not just between Iran and Saudi Arabia or Saudi Arabia and Turkey, but also smaller GCC states who have become much more assertive and also responsible for promoting instability. So it's in this sort of climate that I'm painting to you. I strongly see the need for investment in conflict management and conflict de-escalation around the region, and investment in a series of confidence-building measures that can be supported to promote dialogue on lower level issues like religious tourism, but also building up to climate change priorities that are urgent in the Middle East as well. And ultimately here, all states in the region need to become a productive player, and that includes Iran, which is again seen to be an aggressor, but perceives itself to be defensive in the region. And we know that Iran doesn't have strong support among ordinary citizens in the states where it remains active. We know this because there have been protests that have called out Iran's role in the region. So it is incumbent upon the Iranian government also, I think, to try to move beyond relationships where they proliferate and support non-state actors, and instead engage also productively and help to build stronger, more resilient societies in the Middle East. I think it would be beneficial for Iran's own stability, but also more broadly for the region writ large. So I will stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vakil. I think it's very interesting, as you pointed out, to look at these perceptions of one another from different countries. And I think that's usually represented as being able to look from outside in rather than inside out. Normally, most countries look from inside out and they see their perception of another country, but being able to look from outside in is a lot more difficult. And obviously, for both the USA and Iran, that outside in perspective is very difficult at times. There are ingrained perceptions of both countries, especially in the USA as well, which obviously is rather distant from cultures in the Middle East at times, despite having some excellent diplomats in its history. Before we go on to some of the questions from the audience, we do have Roddy Gow, the chairman and founder of Asia Scotland Institute, on the call. I just want to point Roddy out for those of you who can see him on the Zoom call. And we also have Lady Olga Maitland, who's the chair of the Defence and Security Forum. And Olga, thank you very much for helping to arrange this. I think you have the first question to kick us off.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Ayatollah Safavi, for being such a real friend and coming back to speak with us today, and also to Dr. Vakil for your contribution, and our good friend, Dr. Pansari. Dr. Safavi, you are by nature someone who wants to see the best. You want to be more optimistic, and I can feel that. I was just really wondering on a couple of topics. Can you give us any enlightenment as to what will happen with Mrs. Nasrin Ratcliffe? I realize this is an ongoing, painful issue between the UK and Iran, but maybe we could see something happening that's positive this year. And the other point that you mentioned, and I was interested, is that you mentioned the conflict in the Yemen and how it sounds as if Iran is now having a constructive dialogue with Saudi Arabia. Now that is a very big step, because if that can really be achieved, two things will happen. One is hopefully there'll be a de-escalation in the Yemen, and also perhaps a realignment or a lifting of the tensions in the area. There are so many other topics I'd like to bring up, but I think there's two for the moment. But I'd like to see, how optimistic do you feel for this year? Dr. Vakil has obviously looked long and hard at the JCPOA, we all are, but where do you feel?
Thank you for a very interesting question, and always you were kind to Iran, to me. Thank you. And always you were active for peace and security in the regions. About the Yemen, as I said, Iran really is ready to help Saudi to leave Yemen with good prestige, good gesture. And there is a history. Several times Iran offered to Saudi and even achieved some agreement for some change, some compromise. But later Saudi didn't deliver what they should do. But anyway, at this stage now, Iran again emphasized from direct channel, from back channel diplomacy in London and several countries, country and capital that we are ready to talk about the peace and security in Yemen. And now it is going to have a good progress, and Iran show his positive will that really completely support peace and security in Yemen for Yemeni people. Iran doesn't want anything in Yemen. Just support peace and security of Yemen people and stop Saudi Arabia aggressive behavior, bombarding Yemeni civilian, and even it is the policy of the British government that they are against of the bombarding civilian by the Saudi. Then in this way, there is some common interest between Iran and British government to stop killing civilian by the Saudi fighter. Then anyway, I see it is good sign to change situation in the region and start to establish a better relationship between Iran and Saudi. Both sides now, after years, understand that they need each others. Nobody can control all this area, and we are neighbor, and then we should learn to have positive relationship with each others. It is time to we see the change behavior between Iran and Saudi and start to good progress relationship between Iran and Saudi. From Iranian side, I can say 100% Iran is ready and very faithful to have a good relationship with Saudi and stop Yemen war in favor of the Yemeni people. And for JCPOA, as you said, and Dr. Sanam said very well, that it is the foundation for change relationship between Iran and US, Iran and some other countries. This is the foundation. At first, we should see what is outcome of this agreement, and then we can go further. Then it is foundation for better relationship between Iran. With the Britain and Europe, always Iran and Europe and Britain have good relationship. Even you see in the JCPOA agreement, Trump left, but Britain, Germany, and France remain. Then it is very important for my friends in Scotland that you said the West, from Iran's side, we don't see Europe and America completely similar. They are not similar. Europe, it is Europe. America, it is America. And Europe, in many ways, different from the America. Even in the JCPOA, Europe couldn't deliver the duty because they didn't have ability to stand against America. But in reality, they wanted to deliver what they agree. And this is a very difference between the nature of the Europe and America. And Britain, it is important in Europe for Iran because it is my perspective. I don't talk about the Iranian. This is my perspective and many Iranian perspective that we think that British have better understanding of Iranian culture and politics and Muslim. You see, in Britain, Muslims have, in many ways, they are free, and there is so much differentiation behavior between British government towards Muslim and, for example, France. Then even in Europe, there is a distinguish between the Britain, France, and Germany. And in any way, Britain have different advantage, and we respect to that. And for this reason, I said, we emphasize that Iran and Britain can improve their economic relationship. And it is good for both sides.
Dr. Safavi, thank you very much. So, sorry, Olga, I'm very conscious of time. Would you mind if I move on very quickly to Roddy, the question about Iran and Afghanistan, if you don't mind?
Please go ahead.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. And Dr. Safari, it's wonderful having you on this webinar. I would just mention that you didn't actually answer Lady Maitland's first question, which is about Nazneen Zaghari-Ratcliffe. And I would observe that some movement in that area would, I think, have an immense impact on how people perceive the fine and ancient civilization that Iran embodies and about which so much is studied in Scotland. So that is a question still. But my question has to do with Afghanistan, and that is that as a neighbor of Afghanistan, a country greatly influenced by Persian and Iranian culture, we believe there is a role once the Americans withdraw for you to play. In other words, the neighbors of Afghanistan do have a role to ensure future peace. Could you comment on that, please? Thank you.
About Nazanin, I don't know what is the latest situation, but personally, I hope she can be free soon. And this is my feeling, and maybe we can see some positive progress in the near future, and strongly I supported freedom of this respected lady. And always I supported the cultural and academic and economic relationship between Iran and Britain. And I believe this relationship are very useful for both countries. And whatever I can do to support, to expand this relationship, I will do it. About Afghanistan, as I said in my short speech, it is the problem that when NATO leave Afghanistan, Taliban have big power at the moment in the Afghanistan. Many villages under control of Taliban. Then when NATO leave, then it is maybe again Taliban back to the power, which is not acceptable for Iran for several reasons. First, it is about women's rights, that they should be free for education, they should be free for their cultural, social activity, which Taliban in past had problem with the rights of the women. And second, which is more important, it is about the terrorism station. Iran completely against that. Again, Afghanistan back to become a station for training international terrorists and become a station for attack from Afghanistan to America or anywhere, because especially killing civilian, for us, for Iran, for myself, killing civilian is not important. They are American or they're Jews or Christian or whatever. We are strongly against killing civilian. Then it is a dangerous situation, and Iran actively will engage to be sure that this not happen again in Afghanistan. Third issue, it is the smuggling narcotics, which is against of Europe, because this narcotic from Afghanistan directly come to market of Europe, and it is against of the youth generation in Europe. Iran, for the human consideration against of these matters, and strongly ready to cooperate with Europe and Afghanistan government to not let this matter expand and can control this smuggling. This is Iran perspective.
Thank you very much, Dr. Safavi. I think we'll see what happens in Afghanistan. It's clearly going to be a very complicated situation. I think everyone hopes that Iran will contribute to stability in that area as well. But perhaps talking about stability in the region and the borders of Iran and bordering Afghanistan, we can talk a little bit about China. And perhaps if I could come back to you, Dr. Vakil, because we have several questions from the audience about relations between China and Iran and what that means. If I can just take two of them, from Giles, who has asked, regarding Iranian movement towards China, is this to increase leverage for the improvement in US-Iran relations or negotiations, or does it represent a more durable and sustainable shift in Iran's global positioning? And excuse me if I can just bring in another one, and you can maybe answer the sort of general point about relations between Iran and China. Anthony has asked, US sanctions have pushed Iran into the arms of China, which now occupies a dominant position in the Iranian economy and is able to buy Iranian oil cheaply. Is it in the interests of China and its partners in Iran to maintain these sanctions or to support the restoration of JCPOA? Would you like to talk a little bit about that relationship and how you see that developing?
Sure, thank you. Very interesting and timely questions, particularly because a few weeks ago, Iran and China signed a long-term partnership agreement that would see greater Chinese investment in the Iranian economy. And this relationship, or this agreement in particular, received a lot of domestic criticism and raised alarms, I think, internationally for many of the reasons that were suggested by your colleagues who posed them. I think that there is an assumption that Iran is leaning to China because of sanctions, or has no choice in these relationships, and to a certain degree one can make that case and make that argument. I think there's the nuance here is always much more gray. There are domestic drivers behind this relationship. Iran's political establishment has stronger relations or prioritizes, let's say, a diversified basket of relationships, of which a relationship with China is seen to be safe. China is a non-interventionist foreign actor that doesn't discuss human rights issues or sensitive domestic political issues. So China is seen to be an attractive partner for Iran. But I think more broadly, if you want to consider Iran's broader economic objectives, having a balanced portfolio of relationships is in Iran's interest. And you did also hear Dr. Safavi talk of strong relations with European countries as well that have lost significantly because of the JCPOA. Domestically in Iran, there is a portion of the population that is not particularly pleased by the growing ties with China, sees China as perhaps predatory or flooding the Iranian market, pushing out Iranian merchants. And, in general, Iranians don't see Chinese goods as being as superior. So, it's a complicated issue. And I've also heard Iranian political figures suggest that they could use their relationship with China as leverage in talks vis-a-vis the United States. So everything is on the table here. There are a variety of different perspectives. I think what's important to consider is China's viewpoint. China has a very dynamic engagement in the Middle East that is not just invested with Iran. It has strong relations with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Algeria, and Egypt. They all have comprehensive strategic partnerships, as does Iran. And China is a free rider on the American security provider of the region, and has yet to step up and try to manage or broker or interfere in any of the regional conflicts. I think China is a supporter of the JCPOA, and China would like to see regional stability because that is in China's economic interests more broadly.
Thank you very much. That was a great summing up of another very complex area. If you don't mind, Dr. Kansari, I'd like to ask you something because you've been very, very patiently listening, but you're a former diplomat, and I think I have a question that would suit your diplomatic experience. We have a very interesting question from Jake in the audience, who's asked, in light of the recent discussions which were held in Baghdad between Iran and Saudi Arabia, to what extent do you believe Iraq can be or will be allowed to be a mediator between the two powers? So really the role of Iraq and also the relationship with Saudi Arabia and Iran. And that comes on to several other questions we've had from audience members about Saudi Arabia and whether Saudi Arabia will support the JCPOA. or whether there'll be a blockage to this. I wonder if you could say something about that. Is there a role for Iraq as an intermediary, and also the role of the willingness of Saudi Arabia to proceed constructively?
Thank you. I believe that Iraq can play a positive role, especially the present Iraqi government, which is trying to play a more independent role and try to be equidistant from Iran and the United States, and to sort of have more credibility with its own people, as well as being taken more seriously in the region. So I think that obviously Iran has, as Dr. Safavi pointed out earlier, had made outreach towards the Saudis in the recent past, and all of those were rejected by the Saudis, not by the Iranians, and especially while Trump was president, and the Saudis counted very much on Trump's support. But with the advent of the Biden administration and the more critical view which Biden has had of the Saudi regime, and although within reason, they have been much more amenable in wanting to set aside problems like what they had with Qatar to the side and entering into dialogue with Iran. So I think we are seeing a change also from the kind of vision that the Saudis had of pursuing their policies towards Iran, in terms of becoming much more interested in entering into dialogue as they have done. And I think Iraq is able to play a good role in this, as many other parties in the region, but in particular, Iraq is an untested intermediary and seems to have performed quite well by having arranged, the recent discussions that took place.
Dr. Kansari, you may be recalled to diplomatic service after that wonderfully diplomatic answer. Thank you very much. Get your passport ready to travel. Yes. And we're really coming up to the end of time, but perhaps I could come back to Dr. Safavi. And Dr. Safavi, a non-political question, if you don't mind, from Jim Carroll, who attends quite a few of our presentations, I think. Dr. Safavi, thank you for your presentation. On the shared concern about the climate crisis, what steps do you think might be the priorities of the Iranian government? And obviously coming up to the COP26 meeting in Scotland this year in November, climate crisis, net zero carbon emissions are of great concern and interest to all of our governments, but I think we'd like to understand the Iranian perspective of this.
My first expertise is the philosophy and Sufism. From Iran perspective, I think it is the major issue that that this problem itself has a foundation problem, that there is no philosophical foundation framework to show that humankind why should care about environment crisis. I have 40 mystical points. Every day I publish 1 point in my Instagram. From today, we'll start 40 points about the environmental crisis based on the perspective of Sufism. What we can say that at first we should theorize that nature, it is holy. And when it is holy, then because nature is created by God, and whatever created by God, God is holy and his manifestation is holy. Then it is the foundation, philosophical Sufi foundation, to how we should have self-control of our behavior towards environment. From childhood, we should teach to our kids that we should care about the nature and we should respect to the nature. And nature, it is not just for me, it is not just for America. Nature, it is shared for all humankind and for present generation and next presentation, and it is manifesto as holy super nature. Then for me, what Iran can present, it is more cultural and theoretical perspective for the foundation of respect to the nature and environment. Thank you.
On that note, Dr. Safavi, I think that's a very nice way to close, because most philosophical ending to a very complex, a discussion of very complex political issues, but a spiritual issue in closing is the most appropriate way, I think, to end, and the hope for no conflict and more peace, I think. But thank you very much. Dr. Safavi, thank you especially, because I know it's during the period of Ramadan, and it's the middle of the day already, so the days are long at the moment. So thank you for taking the time during this period of Ramadan to give your views and the views from Iran, which I think are most interesting. Dr. Kansari, your many years of diplomatic experience shone through, and I'm very grateful for you to speaking. And Dr. Vakil, really thank you very much for your broad perspective from all points of view of what's happening in relation to Iran. What a wonderful panel. It really has been our pleasure to host you. And could I hand back to Roddy? Would you like to say anything as we close?
Well, I would just like to add my thanks, and the thanks, I'm sure, on behalf of Lady Olga Maitland. The most important thing we believe at the Asia Scotland Institute is to build bridges between cultures and countries. And I think that the discussion that we've had on this webinar is a wonderful example of how people speaking together can actually address some of these key issues for the benefit of mankind. And so thank you all as participants, and Martin for helping make this happen. And I wish you all well. Thank you. Thank you.